Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and we are continuing on with our SQL Server administration, looking at implementing disaster recovery, aka backing up your system. So overview, what's covered in this video? First of all, database recovery models. We'll talk about what are the three SQL Server recovery models and what is a recovery model. We'll get into SQL Server 2008 database backup, of course, doing it. We'll get into backup types and once again differentiating between backup types and recovery models. They are slightly different. Want to get into backup options. You have a few different flavors, variations, and things you can tweak. Backup strategies. You need to plan what you're going to back up, how you're going to back it up, where you're going to back it up to, how often you're going to back it up, who's going to be responsible. All of those things need to be considered. And then if you look at your topology, what kind of a network setup do you have? That greatly influences your backup strategies. Restoring databases. You know, you've done this work to create these stellar sets of backups, and you hope you never need them, but the reason you did it is because there's a good chance one day you might. So we will definitely look at restoring databases. So jumping in, there's your three recovery models. Full recovery, bulk logged recovery, and simple recovery model. But before we even get into what the recovery models are, let's talk a little more generically. What is a recovery model? In SQL Server, your recovery model simply determines what's available to be backed up. What are you saving? And we'll talk about that in more detail, but for now, with the full recovery model, which is your primary method of backing up SQL Server, everything's available. Your log files are complete. It allows you to do the most precise backup. So let's say, for example, the system crashes at 7:01 p.m. on a particular day. You can restore the system back to a minute before, back to 7 p.m. exactly. And then whatever happened right after that is gone. So you have that kind of control. With bulk logged, you get a little better performance, but you don't have the ability to restore back to a specific moment in time. And then with simple recovery, as you might have guessed, it's very simple. You can recover to a certain point, and that's it. The whole concept of being able to roll back to a particular instance in time is completely gone. But we'll get into those in a lot more detail coming up. Got a lot more information that'll help differentiate those three. But for now, I just want to simply show you how do you set that, how do you change that. But here, let's jump over to our server now. So here I am on my server, my SQL Server box, one of them actually. And I'm going to go to Start, bring up SQL Server Management Studio, log into the local server, click Connect. I'm running as administrator still for now. And going to my databases folder, if I expand that, there's my Veronica's database. Now, if you don't have that in place, you can easily recreate that. Once again, just go to the File menu, go Open File, and go out to the Course Files folder and the subfolder for this video. And there's a script you can run to recreate the Veronica's database. But if I right-click on it and go to Properties, and I can see that, hey, I've been doing my job. The thing actually got backed up relatively recently, both the database and then 12 minutes later, the log file. If I go to Options, I can see my recovery model. Now, collation is not at all involved with recovery model, and compatibility level can play into it, but that's not really involved with recovery or backups either. So we don't really need to focus there for now. But if you hit this drop down, there's your full, your bulk logged, and your simple recovery models. I can change those from here in a production database, but before you do that, there are some things to know about changing recovery models in a production database. It's not something to be taken lightly. You want to avoid it as much as possible. Plan that out up front. Now, as far as planning it out up front goes, see, I'll right-click on my databases folder. I'll leave that up for now. And if I go New Database, go to Options, and we can bring both those up at the same time if we maneuver them just right. And it's really the same interface, just a few less options. So in my new database, here's where I can pick that right up front before I even name the database. So typically that's when you want to have that set. You want to try and set that up front. There are a few occasions where you might need to change it in production, but for the most part you want to leave that static as much as possible. So with that, let's talk a little bit more in detail about these recovery models. So let's move back over to the slides. So let's get into a little more detail on the recovery models, starting with the full recovery model. Transactional logs, they're all saved because once again, that's really the big difference between the different recovery models. This really has nothing to do with what's actually backed up yet. It's only what's available for backing up. Transaction logs are all there, so you can and should back those up. And no work is lost. So, in a perfect world, maybe it's not so perfect because you do have a loss here, but you're able to retrieve data that's been possibly lost due to a corrupted file or go back to a corrected version of the database after someone has inadvertently made a mistake and made a change they should not have made. You can do it to any arbitrary point in time, potentially. Now, this is the data that's provided by the full recovery model. When we get into the actual backup types, there's some things you want to consider there as well. But you do have what you need to recover to, 7:01 p.m. when something went wrong at 7:02 p.m. Normally, once again, no work loss exposure. And I have normally there in italics because, once again, there's things that can go wrong with even a backup. And one of those is right there, I put in parentheses. If the tail of the log is damaged, and what do I mean by that? Let's say you have multiple log backups. If that last log backup is damaged, then any changes that are made since your most recent prior backup will be lost. So we'll look at that, right? But you're going to have not necessarily one backup file, but you may have a backup file within other backups that need to be applied on top of that to get you current. But let's say one of those, maybe the last one in the list, is also corrupted, then you've got a problem. So when do you use the full recovery model, right? That's what I really want to know. When do I do it? First of all, anytime you must be able to recover all of your data. This is the only model that'll give you that. Secondly, if the database contains multiple file groups, you may recall when we did our install, we talked about creating file groups to save our database in or on. You can divide up your backups based upon different criteria. You can slice and dice according to file groups. You can slice and dice according to tables. You can slice and dice according to rows in tables. So it's up to you how you design this. And if you want to be able to do this kind of a piecemeal recovery in case of a loss, you need to be using the full recovery model. Third, you want to be able to recover to a point in time, like I said before. Fourth, you're willing to incur some cost. The downside of a full recovery model is you've got tons of information now that you may or may not ever need that you're backing up. Every single transaction individually is logged and needs to be backed up. So you've got greatly accelerated log file growth. There's also a performance hit there on the last one there, number 5. Because you are actually taking the time to record every transaction, every database transaction, a second time because it's also being written to your log file. All right? So we talked about full recovery. Let's talk about the bulk logged recovery model a little bit. Bulk logged recovery is an adjunct, to use a Microsoft term actually, to the full recovery model. Logs are still maintained, but you just don't get every transaction. So there's some benefits and downsides to that. One of the benefits is if you have high performance bulk copy operations, you're not recording every single transaction that's part of that bulk copy. The log will only show that a bulk transaction occurred. Now, of course, there's also disk space. You don't have each transaction recorded. But the downside is you don't have the ability to go back to a specific point in time during that bulk copy. You get all of it or nothing. There's nothing in between. So as it says here, if the log is damaged or bulk logged operations occur after the most recent log backup, changes since that last backup have to be redone. So let's talk about that and what we lose and what we don't lose. So let's say this is time progressing and we are, doing transactions in our database, and at some point in time we do a full backup. And hopefully at some point later, not too much later, hopefully like right afterwards, we do a log backup. So things are great. And then we do some bulk load operation, right? So we're doing full recovery model. We're doing backups of the system. We're doing log backups of the system. And then we do some bulk load operation. So things are still cool, until disaster strikes, right? Something happens, and at some point in time, there's some corruption that happens in our database or changes made that just wreaks havoc in our environment. How much information do we lose? Well, we lose everything all the way back to that log backup. Because of the bulk load operation, we lose everything back to the log backup. So how do I fix that problem? The recommendation, always back up your log just before you do any bulk operation. Back up your log right after you do any bulk operation. And then the result is your losses are only as far back as your last log backup. So bulk load operations can save you time. Processing runs better, but you have to be a little bit more deliberate now in protecting the information. You can't just rely on your other backup. You need to do additional backups right around that bulk load operation. Okay? So moving on. A couple other things to note about that model. You can recover to the end of any backup. But if a log backup contains any bulk load operations, like we just saw, you cannot restore to a point in time within that log backup. You can only restore the whole log backup. As I was just showing, you have to go back to your last log backup. Now, when do I use my bulk log recovery model? Well, first of all, it's only used as an adjunct in addition to your full recovery model. The benefit is a speed improvement when you're doing bulk logged operations. So when you're doing any large-scale bulk operations and you don't need point in time, right? I need to be able to recover to 7:02 p.m. Well, you don't need that. You want to use bulk load because it's going to load the data a whole lot faster. Second, you have to run periodic bulk operations in your database. So from time to time, you get these bulk data updates that need to be added to your database. Then you're going to be switching back and forth most likely between bulk load and the full load. Third, disk space, because you've decreased the amount of stuff written to your log file. By going with bulk logged recovery and the bulk logged recovery model, you're not logging every single transaction anymore, but the bulk operation is loaded as simply a bulk operation. So you don't use up quite as much disk space. But the thing to remember most of all is as soon as a set of bulk operations finishes, immediately switch back to the full recovery model. And like I said before, make sure you do a full log backup. So jumping into the simple recovery model, the last of the three, and it is quite simple. There's no logs, first of all, so you don't have to deal with managing that. That space is automatically available. Changes, however, since your most recent backup are gone. You just have nothing. You back up the system, you can go back to that point. After that, you're on your own to your next backup. And then you can only recover to the end of a backup. So you can't go back to the previous backup until you want to go and do a portion of that backup. No, it's all or nothing. So it's really simple. You backed up on Monday, you have that point in time you can jump back to. You back up on Tuesday, you can go back to that point in time, right? When do you use it? When the point of failure recovery stuff is not important to you. You're not concerned about being able to go back to 12:02 in the afternoon. And you're willing to lose any updates that happen between backups because you don't have those. All right? So now let's look at backup types. We've talked about recovery models, and I mentioned this before, but I want to cement this. For me, it took a while for these two to separate in my head. Recovery models versus backup types. What's the difference again? Recovery models determine what's available to backup. So like we said, simple recovery models, no log files. Full recovery models, complete log files with the granularity down to every single transaction. And then the bulk load recovery model was somewhere between the two. So backup types determine what's in the backup. So recovery models determine what you can back up, what's available to be backed up. Backup types is where you determine what you do back up, whether it's a full backup, a differential backup, a log backup. Those are some of your backup types. Every recovery model will let you back up the entire database or individual files of the database, individual file groups of the database. So you can do partials or full. And as I have there at the bottom, full backups or differential backups. What's a differential backup? Well, here, let's do this. First of all, what's a full? Contains everything. So a complete backup of a database or the file groups or the files
and also enough log to allow for recovering that data. So you do a complete backup of the database, and then you're going along chug, 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 doing other transactions. You don't need to do another complete backup, especially with a huge database. That would take forever. Some databases I've seen would take a day or 2 or 5 days to back up the entire database. So they're not doing entire database backups often, if ever, right? There's all kinds of things you can do in that situation if it's a 5-day backup for the full thing. But do a full backup, and now just back up the log file for the last 8 hours or the last 2 hours with the full backup, and then reapply the log. You've got everything you need. But looking at a differential backup, it's a little different. It's not just the log file. It's everything since the last backup. So you're not reapplying the log. You have a differential file, basically. So it says here, a differential backup is based on the latest full backup of data. Based on it, in that it's assuming you are going to reinstall that last full backup first, and then you can apply your differential backup on top of that. So some terms to note in this: a differential backup base is a full backup, in essence. A differential backup is everything that's changed since the last differential backup was created. The benefit of doing it this way, it speeds up the backup process. Because if you've got critical data and you want to make sure you're not losing anything, you're going to want to do frequent backups. Well, you can't do frequent backups of massive amounts of information and do it quickly. So what you want to do is back up small amounts of information regularly. That you can do quickly. And then when you go to restore all of this, you basically go with the full backup first, your differential base, put that back in place, and then your most recent differential backup. Now hold on to that, because we're going to see some different variations of that. But in this case, I'm just using a base and then the most recent differential, and I'm set. Now what if a few things have happened after the differential? I just apply the log as well. So there would be 3 parts: the base, the differential, and the log. So let's jump over to my server and take a peek at where all this stuff actually resides. So here I am on my SQL Server box, or one of them, and I still have SQL Server open from the last time we were in here. Bringing back my Server Management Studio, expand databases again. If I right click on my Veronica's database, go to tasks, there's backup. Clicking here, there's my database name. Notice my recovery model is set here. I can't change that here. But right below it is my backup type. And there's my 3 types: full, differential, and transaction log, which is basically what we just talked about. That base, a differential, everything that's changed since the last base, and then the log file, each individual transaction. Quickly reviewing a few of the other things on the screen. We didn't mention this one, copy-only backup. This was a feature added to SQL Server 2005, and you probably won't need it a lot. But here's the difference of this versus some of the others. When you take a backup, you actually change the database. It records the fact that, hey, this got backed up at a certain point. When you're doing differential backups, when you're doing log backups, you're actually truncating the log file so the logs aren't there anymore, those kind of things. What if you want to get in, take a quick picture of the database, sort of like a snapshot, and not really interfere with the regular backup process? Copy-only backup allows you to do that. So you can check that and say, okay, and you get a copy-only that doesn't make any other changes with the schedule of regular backups and what's available to be backed up. Just below that, backup component. You can back up the database. Well, yeah. Well, what's the other option? Well, remember, the database is made up of files and file groups. You can select specific files and file groups to be backed up. You can give your backup set a name and a description. Don't necessarily have to do both of those, but it depends on how you're managing your backups. And you can also put an expiration date on it, as well as specifically say where the backup file is going. So I've backed up this database once before, and I just sent it to the root of my C drive. Don't typically want to do that. I'm going to put that to some network drive somewhere and have that archived off-site, but you can. Just pick a spot. If I want to add someplace new, just click Add, and I can send it there. So I'm going to cancel out of this for now. We'll be back in a second. Clicking Cancel. And I'll go ahead and minimize this as well. And I'm going to move back over to my slides, because I want to just kind of give you a bird's eye view of the different types first, and then we'll jump in. So now we're going to go through the 4 main backup types and just kind of give you a bird's eye view first, and then we'll delve in and actually do some backups. Starting with full database backups, full file backups, partial backups, and then differential. We've talked about these in some form or fashion, but I want to spend a little more time. So starting with our full database backups. So here I am on my SQL Server box, and I'll go to Start, Management Studio, Connect. And when that expands, I can see my databases. I'm going to right-click on my Veronica's database and go to Properties first of all. And we can see if I've been a good SQL Server administrator or not. And ooh, looks like I haven't been real good. My last database backup was on the 30th, which was today, but I never did a log file backup. Not good, guys. You don't want to see that in your history file. But let's go in and fix that. First of all, if I right-click on Veronica's, go to Tasks, go to Backup, and let's walk through this screen. First of all, the source section tells me what database I'm backing up, obviously. What recovery model, we talked about those. There are 3, full, bulk load, and simple. Can't change it here. That's a decision you had to make long before this point. But what you do have to decide at this point is what is your backup type? Full, differential, or transaction log? Obviously, I haven't been here yet, right? We just saw that on the other screen. There's your copy-only backup option that allows you to make a copy of the database and not interfere with the sequence of main backup files, differential backup files, and I should say full backup files, differential backup files, and transaction log files. There's a sequence and a pattern here that we'll see as we go forward. You can just sneak in and grab a copy without changing anything else, all right? What am I backing up? The entire database versus various files and file groups. We're doing the entire thing at this point. Gives it a default name. I could give it a description if I want to. And I can also have a backup file expire after a certain date or on a certain date. The benefit of that, it helps SQL Server help you to manage backups. So that way if you've got tons of old files out there, it basically helps you to avoid grabbing an old expired backup file and putting that in place of the current backup file. All right? Where am I backing up to? My choices are to disk or to tape. My to tape is disabled because I don't have one, and it's smart enough to see that. So it's going to the default location where SQL Server places backups. You'll want to add that. I've been in here once before, so it's there. If I go Add, it defaults to this location for you. And then you can add a file name onto the end. I already have it there, so I'm not going to type that twice. But you click OK, I'm going to cancel, and that'll give you that file there. All right? And if you want to, you can remove it and redo it and see the contents of it as well. But going over to Options, do I want to append or overwrite my current backup? Append to or overwrite my current backup media? Well, I don't have any really. I started the process, it looks like, but I didn't finish. Actually, we did have enough, didn't we? We did have a backup but no log, so I kind of started the process and didn't finish. So let's overwrite it. I can check the media set name and backup set expiration like we talked about on the other screen. And once again, other choices of where to send and save my backups. Reliability, I can verify it when finished, perform a checksum to help verify the file that there's no write errors, and what to do if there is an error. By default, it stops, which is probably good. Or you can just say continue. Transaction log is disabled right now. Why? Because I'm not doing a transaction log backup. If I was doing that, you would see options here, and we'll talk about those in a second. And then there's tape drive. Once again, disabled because I don't have one. Do I want to compress? It's always a trade-off. If you compress, you save space. If you compress, you take more time. So those are your choices there. But clicking OK, I get a backup. Execution got to 100% really, really fast because I have a very small database. In production environments, I've seen this take anywhere from a few hours to a few days. So you do want to consider your time frame you allow for backups. Okay, so click OK, and we're done backing up our Veronica database. Is that true? Maybe, kind of, sort of. Now, I don't have a backup of my log file. Don't really need one yet for what we're about to do. But typically, you'll almost always have a log file backup as well because you create a full backup, and unless something goes wrong immediately after you create the backup, you're going to have some other transactions that have occurred since your backup that you want to include when you restore the database. So tell you what, let's go ahead and do that. Tasks, we'll pretend like 2 or 3 hours have passed, even though it's been more like 2 or 3 minutes. Go to backup again, and this time I'm going to select transaction log. Notice these options went away, which makes sense. The name changed. That's kind of nice. It happens for me automatically. Go to options. Nothing here is any different, but notice these are enabled now. The default is what I want. I want to truncate the transaction log. That says get rid of the old transaction log because it's really big and takes up a lot of space. We want to get rid of those when we can and move them to backup because they're going to be large. Now, they're going to be large in your backup set too. We'll talk about that in a second, but you do want to avoid having multiple copies of a transaction log laying around. So it looks like I'm good to go on this. Click OK. Once again, successfully completed in record time due to my small database size. But if I right-click on my database again, go to Properties, and these times are nicely updated now. They're both showing backups were done today within a few minutes of each other, so that's a good thing. Now, the unthinkable happens. Server goes totally south on me, and I have to restore this thing, and maybe that's not a good scenario because I'm using the same hardware. So let's just say the file got corrupted, right? And I need to restore this thing. What do I need to do? The very first thing you always do when you need to restore a database is you do a backup first. What do I mean by that? Let's look at it. Right-click, Tasks, go to Backup. Change this from full to transaction log, right? Because in most cases, your system isn't dying right after you've performed a backup. Some additional transactions have occurred between your last backup and the time that the corruption or whatever the problem is shows up, right? So you want to get all the transactions that have occurred since your last backup and prior to whatever went wrong, okay? If I go to Options, now it's important that I change this because I don't really care about truncating and all that kind of stuff. I'm just making sure I get that last piece of my transaction log, and I want to tell it that I'm doing that. Click OK. And one other thing to note, back it up and leave it in the restoring state. Because remember, we're in the situation right now, that little twilight zone region where my database has died, all right, something's gone wrong, and I'm in the process of fixing it. By grabbing that last little tail and using this option to do it, it actually puts my database in a restoring state. You'll want to have all the users off at this point, but if the database has died, that's probably not a problem. But just kind of reemphasize that point. Click OK. So my database shows it's in restoring mode. Right-click, go to Tasks, go to Restore Database. Gives me a list of all the files available. There's my full backup, my transaction log, and that last little tail that I copied. Yes, I want all of those. Simply clicking OK. And the percentages are growing good, 100% for each file. So I've managed to restore a database that really had nothing wrong with it, right? So let's try that again, and this time let's break something. So I've got my Veronica's database, and I've got my customers in it, and I've got my flowers. Let's do new query here. And I'm going to select a record. Star from sales dot flowers correction DBO dot flowers where flower ID is equal to 251. I got several versions of this database floating around. So there we go. Press F5, and there is one of the various flavors of this wonderful product that my wife is producing. She can tell you how to pronounce that name. I'm not going to try. What I'm more focused on is they said prices need to go up by 10% because business is booming. Let's do a little SQL statement that causes that to happen. And before we do that, though, let's just check our system time. Turn on my clock. I had it off. Okay, it's 5:31. Let's do an update. And we want flowers. And we're going to set the sales price field. I could have sworn I pressed enter. There we go. Set the sale price field equal to the sales price field times 1.1. Give it a go. run this guy. 445 rows affected, including that thing going from, if you recall, it was $35 before. F5 just to run that portion after I've highlighted it. So it went up by $3.50. Looks like 10%. So that went well, right? Went very well. But let's say somehow or another we fat fingered that and forgot to put the point in there, the point 1 as opposed to 11, right? If we were to run that now, we get a very, very different set of values, and it could start to look pretty ugly. Let's say this happened after we already did the update. And I'm just making up a mistake, right? A lot of things can go wrong. A mistake in the update, somebody corrupts the file, but the point is we want to make a change, okay? So I'm going to let that clock tick by 1 more or 2 more minutes, and then we're going to run this again. So we've fast forwarded a couple of minutes, and I'm going to update again. Once again, I've highlighted the portion that I want to run, just that portion. I'll probably grab the go as well. Click execute. Same number of rows are affected. Select that portion and do execute again. And yep, we've really messed up the pricing. Be great if we could charge at that rate, but I wouldn't count on it. All right. So we got a little bit of a problem. I need to roll back, so to speak, my database. Now, that's a database term that can mean lots of other things, but in this case, I'm referring to going back to a previous backup. Okay. So let's do that. We're going to close this down, first of all. I don't want any users on my database, and this client application actually acts as a user. And I'm going to right-click, go to Tasks. First thing I want to do is back up, right, my transaction log. And I want to get just the tail portion of it and put the thing in restoring state. That kicks it out of production. That's been successful. And now I want to restore my database, this time to a specific point in time. Start. Let's jump back to 5:33. Click OK. Click OK again. Looks like it was successful. Bring back my new query window. If I typed it right, press F5. Didn't even almost type it right. We don't want sales price, do we? We want flower ID. There we go. Looks like I successfully rolled back. Typing it took me a while, but I managed to roll it back exactly where I wanted to. So I went back to the point after my correct update, but before my incorrect update, using my full backup. Way cool. So let's mosey back on over to our slides and move on. So we did the full database backups. Next on the list, full file backups. Now for the Veronica database, we only have one file. We just have our primary file group and our primary database file, our MDF, and then our transaction log, our LDF. So for this one, we're going to take a little deviation from using the actual production database, quote unquote, not that it's really production, right? And we're going to create a sample database to demo this. So let's go over and play around with it. Close all this down. And I'm going to create a database. Right-click, New Database. And I'm going to call it Veronica's 0904 for 2009 April. And this one's going to have some additional file groups. So I'll go to the file groups. And I'm going to add a couple of file groups. One for sales, and one for HR. Go back to general. Because ultimately, we're going to break this database up into multiple groups of files that will be HR related and sales related. So I'm planning ahead this time, right? Now I want to add some files to those file groups. Underscore HR. And I can move it to the HR file group. And I hit enter 1 second too soon. See if we can get back in there. Add another file. There we go. Veronica's again. Underscore sales this time. I'll put this one on the sales file group. Okay, so I've got 3 file groups now. My primary. Notice I can't move my primary file from my primary. My HR and my sales. Click OK. So now I have a database that gives me a little more flexibility on how I store and back up my data. So let's go and do a backup on this new database. Now we don't have any data in it yet, but that's okay. Tasks, backup. Database name defaults the same. Recovery model defaulted to full because our model is set to create full recovery model databases. Backup type is still full, but what I want to look at here is backup component. If I go to Files and File Groups, it pops up a dialog that lets me pick what file or file group I want to back up. Pretty cool. Why do I need this? Once again, as database sizes grow, you may not have time in a 24-hour or 48-hour or 72-hour window to back up an entire database. And chances are, if a database is that large, all of it isn't changing constantly. It's the portions that are constantly being changed that you'll need to back up more often. So let's say I want to grab, well, since it's our first time through on this database, all of it. So we'll start there. Go OK. It gives me what it's backing up. It says it's a full file group backup. And since we're starting off fresh, actually it's a whole new database, so I can do append again. I'm not even concerned about backing up to the same database. Right. So it gave it a whole new file name. So we're good to go there. So just click OK, and I've got my files and file group backup. Now, time is chugging along. Go to Tasks, go to Backup, do a log file backup. Say this is an hour later. Once again, click OK. Now that went really fast because there are absolutely no transactions in the log, right? And then once again, if disaster strikes, I can go and fix it. I can restore. But before we get there, what we wanted to focus on is the fact that if I need to do additional backups, I can just say, give me the primary and say the sales, because HR probably isn't changing that much. I'm not hiring people by the hour, typically, right? But sales is happening every second of the day, hopefully. So clicking OK on that, I can back up just those portions. Right? Click OK again. It backs up that and that only, and I can choose to do that throughout the day or whenever I need to see that happen. So now when disaster strikes, the same rules apply. Right-click, go to Tasks, go to Backup, get the last portion of that transaction log. Switch to Options. We want to get that tail portion. Click OK. Put it into the restoring state, as you can see right here. You'll see that here as well. And now I can restore that just like before. Now we don't have data in there to test around with or play around with this time, but I can restore. Go to Files and File Groups. Here's a list of all of them. Expanding here, I can see the names a little better. Here's my full file group backup. Grab that. Grab my Veronica sales backup. And I did make one more backup of the primary file group, so I'll go ahead and grab that. So I have an additional backup of the sales file group. The only backup I have of the HR file group was from the initial full backup that I took. And in this scenario, that's fine. HR didn't change in the last 24, 48 hours. So backing up to 24, 48 hours ago for that file group is totally fine. The sales team, on the other hand, is hammering away. So I want to back up their stuff far more frequently. And then when I roll back, I can roll back to hopefully a point that keeps my sales team happy. So clicking OK. And I've successfully restored my database. And the main benefit, the main beauty of this is I've cut down on the time it takes to back up the pertinent data, because instead of backing up stagnant data, I'm only hitting the stuff that's changed. And that's the benefit from the file group backups. Let's move back over to the slides. We did full file. What's next? Partial backups. Now, the word partial backups there, as I look at that, I'm thinking about some of the Microsoft documentation. It actually says partial backups, but if you look at SQL Server, and let's go over and do that. I'll bring this back again. We'll go to backup. Backup type. My choices are full, log, and differential, right? Really, differential and partial are being used interchangeably there. But what's a differential backup? A differential backup says take everything that's occurred between your last full backup and the present time and all those log files, and just kind of roll them up into one backup. So that now, if I've been doing log files every hour on the hour, and then something goes wrong at 5:30 p.m., right? About what time it is now, right? I don't have to restore all those log files, because log files are big and they take up a lot of time when it comes time to restore them individually. If I have a differential file that just kind of jumps to the current state of the database, I can bypass all those other log files. So here, let's try that. I'm going to cancel out of here. And let's just make some backups again. So tasks, backup, I'm going to do a full backup. Time stamped at about 5:47, it looks like. Click OK. And let's do a couple of logs. Tasks, backup, just back up my log file. I'm just going to do the defaults on this. Click OK. And all this is happening as an append. Now let's, use our imaginations here. This is happening an hour apart, right? One more backup. And after we get them all done. So I did 2 log backups after a full, right? Now let's go back and look at what I have. If I right click, tasks, and go to restore, I can actually see what I have pretty easily. I have my full, and there should be timestamps if I scroll down. There we go, 5:47, so those are the 3 most recent. I have my full backup, and then I just created a couple of log backups. Once again, in real life, you're doing these about an hour apart, but you don't want to sit and watch me for that long, so we sped that up a little bit. Now, let's say I do my full once a week, and I do my transaction logs every hour. There's a lot of gap in there. Right? I don't want to have a week's worth of transaction logs or 4 days worth of transaction logs on Friday morning when the database crashes at 10:30. I want to have something that's a little more compact than that. And that's what my differentials allow me to do. So let's cancel out of here. I'm going to right click on this database again, a 4th time actually. Click tasks, go to backup again. And this time I'm going to pick differential. Don't need to touch any of the other options because I still want to append. I want to keep everything that I had before. But I click OK. That was successful. Now, disaster strikes. Don't you love that phrase? What do? The first thing you always do is back up the log file. So right click, go to tasks, go to backup, grab my log file. Do I want the entire thing or I want that tail? So tell it I want the tail. Click OK. Puts it in my restore state, and now I can start restoring my database. And here's the difference. Go to restore. Go to database. I don't even default it to it. I don't need these 2 log files. All I need is the full and then any differential plus that last little tail portion of the transaction log. Big time savings if these are, 1 per hour for the last 4 days on a database that's got lots of transactions happening. You just basically jumped from here to here. All right? Click OK. And within a relatively short amount of time compared to installing all those logs again, my database is current. Way cool. So with that, let's move over to our PowerPoint slides again and continue on. All right, a few more things we want to touch on before we finish out, but talking about recovery requirements, you'll want to ask yourself some really important key questions such as how important is it to never lose a change? If it's important that you never lose a change, then you're looking at the full recovery model.
And you're going to be doing more frequent backups, assuming your database is a much more volatile database, more changes. And then how easy would it be to recreate lost data? Those are going to be key in determining how much information you save, because there's always a trade-off. You could say, I want to have everything. I want to be able to go back to any point in time. I want to never lose any transactions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But are you willing to pay the costs? Do you have the resources necessary to make sure that you can maintain all those backup files, that you can perform all those backups, that your log files are not getting so large that you're running out of hard drive space? Because there will be more administrative costs associated with having more robust backups, which allow you to do these things here. Okay? So those are questions you want to ask yourself. Another thing, staffing considerations. As I mentioned before, do you have the staff necessary to manage extensive backups across multiple servers, right? So you'll have to ask yourself those questions. And then data usage patterns. How frequently is your data changing? If your data is changing by the minute versus by the hour versus by the day or month, that'll impact what your potential losses are in case there's any problems with your database files. So you'll have to consider that when you're considering how often to back up and what to back up. Are some tables modified more frequently than others? Now, these are things you want to consider before you actually build a database, because you'll want to separate those tables to different file groups or different files so that you can then back them up independently of the rest of the database. Number 3, are there critical production periods? So are there times when you'll have to have more frequent backups running because of the volume of changes happening? You know, a Visa may need to have more frequent backups during the holiday season versus, say, right after the holiday. Well, maybe right after they're still doing returns, but maybe give them until February, things slow down, right? So whatever your business is, what are the critical production periods, and when is your data most likely to be very, very often changing? And then risky updates or errors. If your database is subject to risky updates or application errors, especially ones that may not be detected immediately, you may want to consider going with a full recovery model, because that's going to let you use log backups to recover the database to a specific point in time. Now, there's one other tool I want to point out, because we've done all of this so far manually, which would be a total bear to have to remember to back up your database every hour on the hour, right? So there is a wizard known as the maintenance plan wizard that helps you to set up some core maintenance tasks, and then it will automatically run these jobs, these tasks, as needed to create your backups for you. So actually, let's go over and look at that maintenance plan wizard and set up a maintenance plan for backing up our Veronica database. So here I am on my SQL Server box again. Go Start, SQL Server Management Studio. Go ahead and connect. And I'm going to expand my management folder and go to Maintenance Plans. If you right-click there, we're going to bring up the wizard, which is a little easier. The new Maintenance Plan tool here is really very similar. A lot of the interfaces are going to be the same. But the wizard gives us a little more focus on just doing database backups. So I'll click Next. Give my plan a name. I'll call it Veronica's Backups. I could put more descriptive information in there if I wanted to. I can go with separate schedules for each task or a single schedule. Well, we want to schedule all of our backups during this time through the wizard. So we want to have different schedules for our different types of backups. So I'll go ahead and click Next. And here's some of the things I can do. We're focusing on backups. I want to be able to do a full backup, a differential backup, and a log backup. So if I click Next, select Maintenance Task Order. Here's the 3 tasks that I selected: my differential, my full, and my transaction log. The order here doesn't really matter that much, and it doesn't even give me a choice with these 3 types of tasks, because we're going to actually put those in different schedules, and that's what's more important. Click Next. Backup type is going with the very first thing on the list, which was my full. I have to tell it what database. I'll hit the drop down. I can do all. I can do my system databases, all user databases, excluding my system databases, or specific databases. And I'm just going for my Veronicas right now. Click OK. Am I doing the database or files and file groups? So the same types of options we saw before when we did it manually. My backup set will expire on or after. That kind of thing is still there. Where am I sending the backup to? Disk or tape? Interesting. Tape is not disabled like it was before when we did it manually. Even though I don't have a tape drive, it's enabled here, so we're going to watch out for that. We get to pick a file. We'll do that a little bit later, so we'll come back to that. Create a backup file for every database. If I was doing more than one database, I could do that. Verify it just like before. I can use compression. We had that option always before too. We just didn't touch on it, but you can tell it to compress your databases. What's the benefit? What's the downside? Benefit, less space for your backup files. Downside, time. So it's always a trade-off. Schedule. Here's the key thing I wanted to get to here. We want to schedule our full backups. Let's say if I click change, it gives it a name. It's nice. It is recurring. That's what we want. It is enabled. And how often do we want it to happen? My choices are daily, weekly, or monthly. What do you need for your business environment? For ours, weekly is probably going to be the best option. It'll give us the right balance between protection of our data and recoverability and performance. You could have a system that's so large that backing up the entire database could take a week or a month. Right? I've actually seen databases that were that big. You just don't back up the entire database on a regular basis, right? You back up portions on it, but we're not to that point yet with this database. So we're going to back up the whole thing every weekend because it takes about 4 or 5 hours, right? So I'll say weekly I'll do it on Saturday because we get a lot of folks come in early on Sunday in our shop, right? Occurs at what time? I'm going to have it start Saturday afternoon. Late afternoon, maybe I should say late evening, 11 p.m. Right? Just in case anybody's working on Saturday. So 11 p.m., everybody's out of there. And they don't get to work on Sunday morning. So it occurs every week on Saturday at this time. How often do I want, or I should say, how long do I want this process to continue? Indefinitely. Or I could have an end date. Click OK. And my full database is scheduled. Click Next, and now I get to set my differential database. Same song and dance. Pick the database, Veronica's. Is my differential a full database, or is it files and file groups? So this can be done separately. The important thing to change here, once again, though, is the schedule. We're going to do our differential every day. So it's also recurring, but occurs daily. Let's say we do that every night at just after midnight. So we'll do 1 a.m. Okay? So again, no end in sight. Click OK on that. So it means at the end of every day, I've got a full backup. Now, if I need to recover, I don't need all those log files for the entire week. Say if something goes wrong on Thursday, I don't need the log files for Monday through Wednesday anymore. All I need is my full backup, my differential from Thursday or maybe Wednesday night, depending on exactly when it happened, and then my tail of my log file or any other log files that followed and the tail. Okay? So I've got my differential. I've got that happening daily. Click Next. And now my log file. Oftentimes, you'll want that to happen daily. Notice that a few things are disabled or not present now. System databases are not listed. The option's gone. We don't have transaction log files with those typically. Those are handled a little differently. Click OK. Same options. Key thing to change again is the time. And for my log file, very common, you want to do that much more frequently. So I'll say daily, and then say not just once a day, but every hour on the hour is the default. It's got a starting time. Looks good. Click OK. Click Next again. Select Report Options. I can actually have a report created and saved or emailed or whatever I want of the actions that have happened with my jobs. And I'll just leave it at the default of write a report and the default file location, but you can change that to any file location that works for you. And like I said, you can have SQL Server actually email it to you. Click Next again. Here's a summary of what I've set up. Click Finish. And my job has been created. Click Close. And this will not do anything for me yet. Why? Everything that happens automatically in SQL Server is driven by this guy here, your SQL Server agent. Mine is currently disabled. So the moment you schedule anything that needs to run automatically,
you want to make sure you start the SQL Server agent. The easiest way to do that, go out to Start, Administrative Tools, Services, scroll down to SQL Server. There's the SQL Server agent right there. It's currently set to manual. Just double click that. You want that to start automatically anytime you reboot, and you want it started right now as well. Click OK. Looks like I was successful. So now my backups are running on their own. Way cool. So let's move back over to the slides. Best practices. Here's a couple of them. Carefully consider your backup needs, like I've said before. But the one that's really, really new, test your backups. We haven't really talked about that yet. I've set this thing to just kind of run automatically in the background. I don't have to think about my backups, right? They're there. It's saving them for me, right? Well, you know, backups can get corrupted too, or maybe a job didn't complete like you thought it did. Maybe a series of jobs didn't complete like you thought they did. So you want to go in and check and test those backups. You can actually restore a backup to another database and then test the database on another installation. So you want to do those kind of things regularly. Offsite storage, of course, right? Depending on how critical your database needs are, but typically you'll want to have some location outside of the server room where you keep your backups. And that location should not only be secure from fire and flood, but also malicious intent on individuals who maybe don't like you or your organization or anything else, right? So you want to definitely have that secure. Now, there is no such thing as a lock that can't be broken, but you do want to consider the sensitivity and the value of the information you're backing up, because that will determine how much you need to invest in making sure it is secure. Your system databases. We didn't really mention those when it comes to backups, but this is key. Your master database is what drives everything. If that's corrupted, nothing happens. SQL doesn't start, nothing. How often is it changed? Not very often. Every time you create a new database, delete a database, make changes to a database, the master database is getting updated. So you want to back up your master anytime you create or modify any database or any database object. Okay? Anytime you make any other system changes, back up the master. The model. You don't need to back up the model very often because if you recall, the model database is simply a template that's used anytime you create a new database. Now, if you've got a really elaborate template that you've created, you'll want to back it up, and then anytime you make a change to that model, you'll want to back it up. But other than that, it shouldn't be changing. Your MSDB, use the full recovery model. What is MSDB? That's the database that's actually used by the SQL Server agent. So that job we just created, it's saved somewhere. It's not saved in the master. It's saved in MSDB. So anytime you're making changes to jobs, you definitely want to back up your MSDB. Okay? And then last but not least on this page, your temp DB. Not only do you not want to back it up, I don't believe SQL Server will even let you back it up. It's just a temporary scratch paper space. So there's no reason to back that up. Actually, SQL Server automatically destroys and recreates it every time you start and stop the server. Some other databases, if you're dealing with replication, you get one more system database. That's the distribution database. And then there's the publisher of your information and the subscriber to your information. You'll want to use full recovery on all of those and use the same rules that you're using on any other sensitive data. So what did we cover? Database recovery models. We talked about what the recovery models were, right, and how they were different from backup types. Once again, recovery models, and we have this coming up in a bit on the terms page, but recovery models talk about what is available for backing up versus backup types, what you actually backed up and when and all that kind of detail, okay? Make backup strategy decisions early. I really should say early on this. You want to make your decisions on what's going to be backed up when you're designing the database. Because the analogy I've given a few times now, certain data is going to be more volatile than other data. You want to be able to back up that information, perhaps, or I shouldn't say always, but perhaps you may want to be able to back up that information separate from the rest of your database. You'll have to lay out your database design to allow for that up front.
And then recovering a database. We talked about how to recover a SQL Server database using the restore options. So what are the new terms we learned? Recovery models. Once again, recovery models determine what's available to be backed up. And we said there were three. There was the full recovery model, which is the more commonly used. There's the simple recovery model. The main difference between those two, the simple doesn't bother saving the log file, the transaction log. And then there was the bulk logged recovery model, which is more like the full recovery, except it doesn't give individual transaction log entries for every single transaction. You can do bulk transactions and have the entire thing entered as a bulk transaction in the log. The benefit, the process runs faster because it's not taking the time to make transaction log entries for every single database change. The downside, you can't recover to a specific point in the midst of that bulk transaction. Okay. Then we talked about backup types, and they determine what's actually in a backup. We had the full, we had the differential, we have the partial, we have the file, and we had transaction log files. Talked about full backups. Once again, that's the entire database. Differential or partial backups. What's changed since the last backup, right? How we use those. File backup backs up specific database files. And your log backup backs up the log file. And now, what should you know how to do? You should be an expert in performing a full backup of your SQL Server database, well, maybe with a little more practice. Perform differential backups of your SQL Server database and understand why you would want to make a differential backup. What's the benefit of that? Perform backups of your key files and any table that needs to be backed up. You should be able to restore, or another way to put it would be roll back a SQL Server database to a specific point in time. And then last, you should be able to create an automated maintenance plan that automatically maintains database backup logs so that if you need to go on vacation, all you need to do is point someone to the plan that's running and to just monitor that, and your backups continue as you have planned. So with that, that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.